I received the packet as part of a municipal evidence transfer tied to the condemnation of a neighborhood cinema. The materials assembled under routine closure paperwork contained an irregular core, a single unlabeled projection reel, and an associated body of documentation showing that the reel did not project the same way twice, and over time began to include views of the theater itself that no ordinary camera could have recorded. That is the anomaly recorded in the first line of the index, and the one I treat as primary. The reel's internal sequence changed between screenings, and later projections contained impossible internal footage of the auditorium and of the projection booth. The physical and documentary materials arrived in fragments. The reel was partially shrunken and brittle, its leader scissored away in places, and no distributor, slip, catalog card, or production record accompanied it. The paper trail was a scatter of maintenance logs, handwritten repair notes from an elderly projectionist, apprentice comparison sheets, police property inventories, preservation lab reports, a small set of loose frame scans, and a final damaged audio recording taken inside the booth. Several projection booth documents had been misfiled with municipal closure forms. The loose frames were separated from the rest and found within an unrelated media preservation packet. The file only emerged as coherent after cross-referencing the booth notes with the apprentice's later catalog entries. The elderly projectionist's handwriting appears most frequently in the bundle. He logged nightly after-hours screenings for months after public operations ceased. His entries are functional and spare. In a late repair note, he wrote in a hand that trembled but remained legible, "Ending wrong. Splice not matching scenes. Must fix." The apprentice's catalog pages, created after the projectionist's death, tracked multiple screenings with precise frame counts and splice diagrams. In one brief margin, the apprentice wrote, "Frame order varies, not an editing error." That short phrase, repeated in different forms across several pages, became the pivot by which the materials were identified as a single case. Initial documentation treated the reel as a deteriorated and possibly incomplete black and white feature. Early booth notes recorded small continuity issues, a line of dialogue appearing before its scene, a background figure absent in one projection and present in another, a prop that shifted from table left to table right between shows. Those discrepancies were recorded as technical oddities and treated with the customary repairs. The projectionist made splice corrections, marked apparent frame repeats with grease pencil, and annotated the film edge with repair symbols used in standard practice. His notes repeatedly returned to the same concern. The ending did not sit correctly with the rest of the picture. Lab reports appended later show that preservation technicians attempted standard analysis. Film stock measurements indicated consistent origin across samples. Damage patterns along the sprocket holes corresponded to repeated projection rather than purposeful cutting. Yet, even the lab work introduced new irregularities. Frame counts that should have been constant differed between transferred segments. Areas noted in the projectionist's hand as single continuous scenes appeared in preservation scans as segments with varying internal orders. The lab flagged the set as having internal instability, but did not extrapolate cause. Their final recommendation was to avoid further projection testing until additional controls could be put in place. Municipal records corroborate continued after-hours electrical use and police entries that occurred without public explanation. A property inventory made on the day the cinema was sealed lists the reel as evidence number 376, described only as unmarked celluloid reel partial. The inventory was otherwise indifferent. It failed to connect the reel's unusual annotation examples to the projectionist's logs until the apprentice's later transfer of his own notes to the same municipal office. That transfer was the clerical coincidence that made this file comprehensible. Two details from the earliest materials deserve emphasis because they act as recurring constraints on interpretation. First, the reel was not an aggregate of unrelated prints. Its film stock, sprocket wear, and repair marks show it functioned as a single exhibition element across months. Second, the progression of documentation moves from ordinary repair and notation to methodical comparison, then to lab analysis, and finally to the inclusion of physical scans that depict the auditorium and the booth from angles that were not available to projection equipment during standard exhibition. The archival trace thus presents a bounded anomaly, a discrete film element that refused fixity and began, in the documented sequence, to incorporate the projection environment into itself. I assembled this file from municipal transfers, misfiled booth logs, and scattered preservation papers. The materials are now cross-referenced in the vault index under the reel's temporary entry. What follows in this file is a reconstruction of the documented evidence. My role here is limited to that reconstruction. I do not append explanation. The central irregularity stands. The reel altered its own sequence between screenings and later contained images of the theater and booth that ordinary projection practice could not have produced. I identified the first cluster of materials as routine booth paperwork. That initial impression is important because it explains why the reel remained in municipal custody so long, and why its oddities were treated at first as ordinary maintenance problems. The earliest items I catalogued were the elderly projectionist's nightly logbooks. They are physical notebooks bound in soft cloth, pages softened from frequent handling. The entries are dated and time-stamped in the projectionist's small economical hand. At the outset, they read like any competent technician's record: show start, lamp hours, reel tension, notes on splice quality. They also contained the first credible indications that the reel behaved irregularly. The projectionist began his after-hours work following the theater's official closure. Municipal transfer records show the venue was condemned to prevent public occupancy in late autumn. Police logs corroborate repeated after-hours presence by a single person who retained a key. The notebooks begin 2 days after closure. Entry headings show a consistent ritual: one-page lists, line by line, identical entries for projector lamp, lens cleaning, and gate inspection, followed by short, idiosyncratic remarks about the film itself. The remarks are brief, practical, sometimes technical. The first of them I will quote because it establishes both the clerk-like quality of the record and the unusual object of the projectionist's attention. Reel 3. Dialogue early on. Cut edge at 33. Resplice. That fragment appears on an otherwise ordinary ledger page dated within the first week of the closed house screenings. What the ledger records as minor continuity errors are the earliest concrete evidence that the anomaly existed in some form. The projectionist noted the same set of small inconsistencies across successive nights. A line of dialogue attributed to a late parlor scene appeared earlier than expected. A woman who had been present in the background of a dining room shot on Tuesday was absent in the same shot on Thursday. A teapot switched from a left side table to the right between shows. Each entry treats the instances as problems of editing or projection mechanics. The projectionist's responses were procedural. He made splice corrections. He marked suspected repeat frames with grease pencil along the film edge. He adjusted lamp timing. He rethreaded the print in different platter sequences. He recorded the interventions with the same succinct language he used for lamp hours. Splice at gate replaced. Advance one frame at 36. Grease mark repeated at 12:12. Technically, the material traces looked ordinary at first. Film stock samples in the file later confirmed that the element was a single piece of stock. Sprocket wear patterns correlate across segments. The original leader had been trimmed and in places removed entirely. Where leader material remained, it was brittle and browned. These physical observations were consistent with long-term exhibition and repeated handling. They allowed an initial conservative explanation. The reel was deteriorated and had suffered careless repair in the past, producing continuity errors during projection. For several weeks, the projectionist and then a small circle of municipal preservation contacts treated it as such. The first procedural failure occurred when the projectionist's repair marks did not remain stable from screening to screening. He used the standard practical shorthand of projection work. Grease pencil ticks at suspected repeat frames, small numbers written in the margin of spool diagrams, and a shorthand notation for splice types. At first, these marks were effective. He would find an errant cut, trim, and replace it with a new splice, and the film would run with fewer problems for a handful of nights. Then the signs returned, but not at the same places. On one page, the projectionist recorded a splice replacement at a frame he identified as A12. 2 nights later, he wrote, A12 appears earlier. Dialogue jumped to A12. The notation suggests that the splice point alone had not migrated. Rather, the frames preceding and following it had changed relative positions. I do not reconstruct these early entries as a narrative of mounting terror. The projectionist did not write in that register. He wrote like a technician, and for a time, he sounded like a technician trying to solve a stubborn but conceivable problem. His notes document a methodical approach, rechecking the camera negative during inspection, measuring frames by sprocket count, cutting marginally when double frames were suspected, sealing splices with approved tape and cement. The log records his incremental care. He kept a list of replacement materials. He documented lamp burn cycles and gate clearance. He traded standard practice for repeated patients. One of his later pages contains a short operational list. 2 splices tonight, 16mm cement. Mark, repeat. Check frames 312 to 400. Lamp set 7:5 a.m. to 9:0 p.m. That kind of detail anchors the material in a recognizable workflow. Still, the anomalies accumulated. The projectionist's entries moved from technical shorthand toward a repeated linguistic focus on the film's ending. The earliest remark I previously quoted came in the first week. By the end of the first month, the technician's annotations are less purely technical. On a page in the 5th week, the projectionist annotated a splice diagram with a marginal note that reads, ending not lining with preceding rhythms, splice not solving picture. It is a terse sentence, but it registers a shift from a problem of mechanical continuity to a problem of narrative continuity. The projectionist treats the film not simply as an object to be made to run, but as a sequence that must be correct in order. His interventions are focused increasingly on the terminal minutes. One of the field notes the projectionist left is useful for understanding how he worked in the early phase of the case. He drew a careful spool diagram after a troubled screening and annotated it with frame counts and times. The back of that page contains a short numbered list. 1. Find repeat frames near 1200. 2. Remove duplicate. 3. Join with splice. 2. 4. Rerun at 11:30 p.m. He then recorded the rerun time and lamp hours. The rerun entry is followed by the ambiguous remark, "and still off." That pattern repeats. He would attempt repairs, measure their effects, and record whether the terminal sequence still sat with the rest of the reel. Technicians with access to the bundle told me they found the projectionist's persistence noteworthy, but not, at this stage, inexplicable. Obsession with an imperfect print is not uncommon in the trade. What made his case divisible from ordinary preservation effort was not the persistence but the result. The corrections did not predictably produce consistent outcomes. The municipal police reports attached to the file provide an early institutional confirmation of continued activity at the closed theater. They are brief, formal entries. The responding officer recorded finding lights on and the projector in operation, but no ticketed audience. The officer's note reads as an uninterested administrative observation. No patrons present. Operator identified as former staff. No signs of forced entry. Projector in use on stage 3. Intermittent projection. Inspector advised to secure house. A follow-up log records the operator's cooperation and mention of his reason for continued screenings, film practice, and attempt at repair. Those reports indicate that the projectionist acted with some degree of tacit municipal tolerance for a period. They also show that his work was visible to outside authorities, even if nothing about it seemed immediately dangerous or criminal. Something about the reel's behavior began to resist ordinary mechanical explanations as the weeks passed. The projectionist's notes record an early example that demonstrates the pattern. On a single night, he wrote 3 separate timing measurements for what he identified as the dining sequence. The measurements are precise. Frame counts between splice markers, run times down to 1/10 of a second, lamp cycles. 2 nights later, he repeated identical measurements and found them different by a margin he described as not accounted by speed drift. He used that phrase deliberately. Projectionists are attuned to the mechanical variabilities of their machines. They have worked with projector motors that run slightly fast or slow, and with film that stretches with heat. He had calibrated for those expectations. His explicit note that the discrepancy was not accounted for by the usual causes is a first formal admission that his problem might be something beyond a technician's ordinary tool set. Those early pages also show the projectionist's tentative engagement with documentation beyond his booth. He sent, according to an accompanying transfer receipt, a short package of spool diagrams and repair notes to a city preservation contact. The contact's reply, present in the file, recommended lab evaluation and suggested transfer to a preservation facility should the problem persist. The projectionist's initial response thus migrated from perfunctory repair to the soliciting of external analysis. That sequence corresponds to the arrival of the preservation lab's earliest report in the bundle, dated mid-case. The lab's first analysis is conservative. Photographic stills taken under inspection reproduce the apparent mismatches. The technicians note the physical brittleness of the leader, the presence of cement splices, and variations in wind tension consistent with repeated platter projection. The lab recommended the usual precautions: halt routine projection for a more thorough transfer, perform a comparative frame-by-frame scan, and assess whether duplication could preserve the film before further deterioration occurred. Crucially, the lab did not, in its first pass, attribute the anomalies to anything beyond deterioration and prior poor repair. Their observations emphasize structural congruity of stock and chemical composition, not sequence. Their early recommendation was to avoid burning new splices without a reference negative. They advised the projectionist to provide a running log of the real state across screenings. The technician's formal report includes a short quoted fragment from a phone call with the projectionist. He insists the end feels wrong. He said he will continue notes and send spool diagrams. That incidental quotation acts as the first time the projectionist's subjective insistence appears in external institutional records. Within the booth notebooks, however, the projectionist's language becomes at once more precise and less technical. He used the idiom of repair, but applied it to narrative shape. One of his diagrams is a hand-sketched film strip with arrows indicating sequence and small notes about the emotional tenor of particular shots. Beside an arrow connecting 2 spliced frames, he wrote, "This cut breaks rhythm. truth of scene lost. The phrase is not rhetorical flourish. It is a technician's observation of continuity failure expressed in the language of the film's internal logic. The shift in diction is an early sign of his projective aim. He was attempting to restore what he considered the film's proper internal order, not merely to make the object run. Investigators who later examined the file noted the projectionist's repeated care for the final minutes. My own review of the early notebook cluster corroborates that concern. He concentrated his measurements there. He drew more detailed splice maps for the last 8 minutes than for any other segment. He recorded not only frame counts but descriptive timestamps. Final shot black around 11:58 p.m., then jumped to interior corridor. Next night corridor, earlier by 20 frames. Those night-to-night notations show that the projectionist was not merely guessing at narrative correctness. He was documenting variance. It is worth emphasizing the ordinary curb he attempted to apply. He did not resort to metaphoric language in the early records. He tried what any careful technician would try. He copied marginal frames, created contact sheets on a lap scan, and filed spare frames in a small envelope labeled rejects. He left test strips taped to notebook pages, annotated their edges, and recorded each physical intervention in a ledger. The procedural traces are dense, and in the first month appear effective at diagnosing some problems. Yet, aggregate comparison shows that new repairs introduced new discrepancies. He would remove a suspected duplicate frame only to find the supposed duplication manifesting differently or at different time codes when the reel next ran. One particular early entry demonstrates the odd feedback between documentation and projection. On December 12th, according to the log, he marked a repeat with 3 grease pencil ticks and noted time code. He then removed what he took to be the redundant frames and rejoined the strip. 2 nights later, he logged that the same grease pencil ticks now appeared earlier in the reel at an unexpected point. He rescanned the modified segment and found the physical splice in the place he had made it, but the projection timing placed the content associated with that splice at a different narrative point. The projectionist was explicit about his confusion. Splice remains where placed, picture not aligning, frames in wrong order despite repair. That sentence in his own hand is one of the earliest documented instances where the materiality of the stock and the content it carried no longer produced a fixed mapping. By the time municipal preservation contacts had been engaged intermittently, the projectionist's notes had become quasi-epistolary reports of repairs and failures. He began to include small, rough transcripts of the end sequences as he experienced them. Where early notes offered shorthand descriptors, later pages reproduce snatches of dialogue with approximate time codes and chair positions for background people. He did this not to produce a narrative, but to create cross-checks. His thought process is visible. If the same line of dialogue and the same set of background objects remain constant, then repair can proceed. If they do not, then repair is moot. This practical attempt at empirically solving the problem is the part of the dossier that initially convinced my colleagues to treat the packet as more than an anecdote. The projectionist's pages are full of precise attempts to compare measured frame counts, a catalog of splice types used and their locations, and catalog numbers for replacement cement and tape. The more precise his documents became, the less his interventions reliably produced stable outcomes. That pattern is the core observation of this stage of the file. The projectionist's records show him moving methodically from assumption of standard causes to a formal admission that something else was wrong. He never framed this in dramatic language. He simply began to record anomalies in a tone of escalating professional perplexity. The first outside notation that the problem might not be purely mechanical appears in a marginal typed memo from a municipal archivist inserted into the preservation packet. The archivist wrote, "Operator reports that cuts appear at different positions on subsequent runs. He has documented attempts to repair. Lab advised to proceed to transfer only under controlled conditions." That memo is a procedural checkpoint. It acknowledges the projectionist's efforts and sets an institutional course that, at the time, was routine. Get the material into a controlled environment for duplication and forensic comparison. It also implicitly registers a caution that the community involved in preservation did not yet have a satisfactory explanation. Institutional caution did not prevent the projectionist from continuing to screen the reel. He kept doing so consistently, for reasons he recorded with mechanical clarity, to test repairs, to observe the reel's behavior under light, to maintain the instrument. The notebooks show that most nights he ran the reel between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., timing sessions by lamp hours and noting spool placement with the same care he used for splice notation. One page lists a typical session in granular terms. 11:35 p.m., thread and warm, run to 12:10 a.m., observed transition failure at 11:58, made minor trim at 12:17, rerun to 12:40, end still out by irregular time. The repetition of this procedural language throughout the early pages is a record of pattern rather than conclusion. Because the projectionist documented his interventions with such care, we can see where ordinary explanations began to fail in concrete terms. He attempted the standard procedural corpus available to any competent projectionist. Replace splices, check tension, rethread, adjust shutter, and measure frames. Each time he did so, his records indicate diminishing returns. He reported fewer successes and more unexpected recurrences. The entry that closes this initial discovery period is notable for its refusal of technical closure. In the margin of a detailed splice map, he inserted a 2-line note. Tried splice reference. Nothing consistent, continuing nightly to map. That is an admission of procedural impotence expressed in plain language. The discovery stage ends with the projectionist clearly intent on measurement and correction, yet confronted by a material that did not respond reliably to those corrections. The notebooks, municipal notes, and early lab contact form an evidentiary triangle. Persistent, methodical human effort. procedural institutional response, and early scientific caution. None of these elements initially produced a theory beyond ordinary wear and repair. What they did provide and what they left intact was a carefully documented record that the film's internal order was not stable in the face of standard technical intervention. That unresolved empirical fact is the primary result of the early phase of the case, an apparently ordinary maintenance problem that, despite competent human effort and conservative institutional response, resisted containment. The projectionist continued to work, the notes continued to accumulate, and the core irregularity, variance in internal sequence, with particular instability in the ending, moved from hypothesis into documented practice. When the projectionist died and the materials passed into municipal custody, the younger apprentice took on the task of comparison with a rigor that the earlier files only implied. He worked from a different professional instinct. Where the elderly man had treated the real as a living mechanical object to be coddled and nudged, the apprentice treated it as data to be captured, measured, and reduced to a repeatable record. I reconstruct his program from his comparison sheets, his catalog pages, and a series of dated notes he appended to the preservation packet. The documentary turn is abrupt. What had been intermittent, tacit maintenance becomes an explicit experiment. The apprentice documented procedure more fully than the projectionist had. He established fixed environmental parameters, recorded lamp hours, used a calibrated intermittent pin for frame counting, and photographed the film leader under magnification before and after each run. He built a simple protocol that he expected would remove human inconsistency. He ran multiple controlled screenings with standardized threading, then performed photochemical transfers in the lab and produced digital scans of segments at fixed frame rates. His working page began with an inventory of equipment, then a list of discrete steps: rethread, warm lamp to nominal intensity, run to marker, measure frame count, remove reel, perform transfer, compare files. Each step appears to have been followed and rechecked. The material he left behind is the most methodical body of data in the packet. Those data are where the case stops being a single, errant maintenance problem and becomes a set of contradictions that cannot be reconciled by process. The apprentice frequently tabulated frame offsets and reproduced the projectionist's earlier splice maps. He annotated 3 separate nights with the same nominal scene labels, and then placed side by side the preserved transfers derived from each night. Where the projectionist had written that a given transition occurred at a consistent point, the apprentice found shifts measured in dozens of frames. Where the elderly man had made a clean cement splice, the apprentice sometimes found a tape splice at that same point in later runs. In one comparison table, the apprentice wrote, in a hand that starts controlled and becomes visibly hurried, splice present at marker 3 on run A, absent at marker 3 on run B, tape splice at marker 2 on run C. He followed that line with a short, unadorned marginal note. Not an editing error. That phrase recurs in the packet, and it functions as a hinge between procedural work and the admission of a new problem. The apprentice did not reach that conclusion lightly. His pages include the comparative consequences of microscope inspections, chemical swabs of adhesive residue, and spectrographic reads of emulsion density. The lab results he cites indicate common stock origin for the samples and were consistent with years of projection. They do not indicate third-party reassembly or tampering, yet the visual sequences produced by the transfers do not map to a single fixed order. I will present a few representative instances drawn from his comparison sheets because they illustrate the specific ways in which the reel refused to be catalogued. On the night catalogued as March 11th, the apprentice documented a run with the final scene beginning at frame 18,192 on the transferred file. He marked the same transition as beginning at frame 17,870 in the transfer from March 15th. A third run, April 2nd, showed the final sequence beginning at frame 18,306. He annotated these numbers and drew arrows between them as if trying to force an alignment that would not hold. He added notes about adjacent splice types and the presence or absence of grease pencil marks on the film edge. The sequence of numbers is concrete. The contradiction is not rhetorical. The kinds of physical anomalies the apprentice recorded are precise and, in some cases, oddly specific. He noted a grease pencil mark at approximately 24 millimeters from the sprocket edge on a run labeled February 19th. The mark is absent in the digital file created from the same physical reel on March 4th. On March 22nd, he photographed a cement splice at a section he calls Transition B and cataloged the adhesive residue with a small smear sample. The lab later reported that the smear contained the same type of cement used in local projection shops, which suggests a legitimate repair. On April 9th, the apprentice found a tape splice directly overlaid on what he had previously photographed as a cement splice. He recorded both images in sequence, annotated the discrepancy, and then underlined the observation with a short entry. Splice location moves. These are not cosmetic differences. Some of the discrepancies involve internal continuity in ways that affect meaning. Dialogue appears displaced. Lines that the elderly projectionist had transcribed as belonging to the penultimate scene appear earlier in other runs. Background figures occupy different seats in repeated viewings. A prop that the projectionist had circled as left table lamp in his repair notes alternates its position from shot to shot in the apprentice's captures. The apprentice attempted to quantify these changes. He made a table that lists the presence or absence of specific props and background figures across 5 transfers. The table reads like a ledger of instability. Yes, no variable. The preservation lab's independent transfers complicated rather than clarified the pattern. The lab performed full-frame scans of several segments for the apprentice and provided time-stamped TF sequences and a technical report that summarized anomalies in dry engineering language. The lab noted that the film stock matched physically across sampled segments, and that edge damage indicated repeated projection rather than recent tampering. But the lab's transferred sequences themselves were inconsistent. The lab report contains a short fragment that I quote to show their measured alarm. Comparison of transferred sequences indicates non-reproducible frame ordering in sections adjacent to the film's terminus. Recommended cessation of further projection testing until investigative controls are established. That recommendation was procedural, not speculative, yet the data that provoked it pointed beyond ordinary mechanical failure. One early turning point in the descent is the appearance within the transferred image files of views of the auditorium that are not accounted for by the film's apparent content. The first such insert is small and, at first glance, could be read as a framing device. It appears as a two-frame cutaway in one transfer. The frames show the rear aisle of the closed theater, seat backs, a strip of carpet, and a small red emergency light fixed to the curtain edge. The image is low contrast, possibly an underexposed insert, but it is clearly not part of the interior mise-en-scène of the documented scenes. The apprentice attached the two-frame capture to his April document and labeled it Insert House. He wrote, "Source undetermined, camera position impossible for capture during exhibition." That phrase appears again and is corroborated by a separate sheet of loose frame scans found misfiled in the preservation packet. Those loose frames are among the most troubling artifacts in the file. They arrived in a different envelope, undated, and they show individual frames cropped from the film emulsion. Some of them include edges with repair marks in red and black pencil that correspond to marks the projectionist had made by hand. Several frames depict vantage points from within the auditorium that standard projection practice could not produce. One loose frame shows a view from inside the projection booth, looking out through the booth plate and down the length of the house. The angle places the camera roughly where a projectionist's head would be if it were outside the booth looking back in. Another loose frame depicts the projector gate reflected in the theater glass with the filament glare visible as a plain white bloom. The lab annotated these frames with accession numbers and noted a peculiar detail. The grain structure and emulsion scratches on the interior view frames match stock from the reel, not a later insertion. The apprentice confronted these frames in the context of his own controlled transfers. He began to document not only shifts in continuity, but the emergence, between transfers, of new interior inserts. He kept a running index that tallied internal insert events by run number. The index shows a clear trend. The more frequently the reel was run under controlled conditions, the more internal inserts appeared. On runs where he performed direct photochemical duplicates and then compared the duplicates frame by frame, he found interior images that had not been present on earlier duplicates. He wrote, again with a growing force of repetition, "Insertion rate increases with documentation," and circled the observation. The physical evidence in the film itself also shifted in ways that resisted simple explanation. The apprentice documented repaired perforations, shelving patterns that indicate multiple generations of tension adjustment, and small abrasions on the emulsion surface. He took high magnification photographs of the perforation edges and sequenced them. Where one would expect a single, coherent pattern of wear from a single projection path, he photographed adjacent frames whose sprocket wear patterns are inconsistent with one another. A small patch of perforation damage repeated in two different locations in separate transfers, but not in the same relative frame position. The apprentice included a photo plate that shows one torn edge here and the same tear appearing apparently elsewhere on the same strip in a different run. The lab later described this as a locality shift and registered it as an unexplained irregularity. The apprentice also experimented with deliberate markers. He made removable markings on the film edge in water-soluble ink and then re-ran segments, intending to track whether those marks remained fixed. In several instances, the marks vanished from their original positions in subsequent transfers. In other runs, marks appeared in positions that had been unmarked. He logged these occurrences with dates, temperatures, lamp hours, and the exact composition of the ink used. His note for May 3rd reads, "Ink mark at splice 3 removed. Appears at splice 1 on transfer C. Solvent tested. No bleeding detected on original. Repeat test failed." The note is simple and procedural. Its implication is not. Audio records further complicated matters. The final damaged booth audio included background cues and the projectionist's own breathing and muttered measurements. The apprentice compared the film-derived magnetic tracks preserved in the lab transfers with his own registry of dialogue placement. He found that lines of speech that the projectionist had transcribed for what he called the penultimate scene are placed elsewhere in the lab-pulled tracks. The audio tracks sometimes contain ambient noises that the projectionist had not described on nights he had written his own running notes. The squeal of a chair rail, the snap of a jacket, the distant hum of an electrical service panel. These acoustic features appear in transfers where the visual image shows a continuous domestic scene. The apprentice tabulated these mismatches and wrote across a page, "Dialogue shifts, ambient house sounds present in different files." The apprentice's bridge between observation and interpretation is cautious by design. He does not offer speculation in his notes beyond procedural hypotheses. He proposed in one internal suggestion to the lab that further study should try photochemical duplication with different tension settings and perhaps different intermittent pins. He also suggested an isolation run with the booth shutter physically disconnected to determine whether any internal imaging was being created in the gate area itself. The lab acknowledged his proposal and opened a small controlled study, but their report is terse. The transfers continued to disagree, and new inserts continued to appear. At a practical level, the apprentice's careful mapping produced another, more destabilizing phenomenon. Where the projectionist had been content to mark a problematic line and retest informally, the apprentice's insistence on precise measurement and replication produced more detailed and thus more contradictory data. The file shows a clear escalation. As measurement intensity increases, anomalies proliferate and acquire internal specificity. New splice positions, new interior frames, and new shifts in frame order emerge. The apprentice's own marginalia acknowledges the irony. On his April 27th page, he scribbled, "More data, more divergence, mapping not closing gap." The materials also exhibit corruption and loss that complicates any reconstruction. Several of the apprentice's data cards became unreadable due to a combination of magnetized filing and water staining. Where the projectionist's notebook pages remain legible, some of the apprentice's early transfers are partially corrupted or truncated. One transfer file ends with digital noise for the final 3 seconds. The corresponding physical segment shows a vertical abrasion that appears to match the noise if one assumes a simple mechanical correspondence. Other files are incomplete in ways not obviously explained by mechanical failure. A memory card used during a digitization run is stamped with a log entry that reads, "Card corrupted on import." The apprentice's notation beside that entry is terse. Corruption coincides with appearance of booth frame at minute 32. It is a layering of material failure and evidentiary implication. Contradictory witness traces also populate the dissent. The municipal police logs record a forced entry on one date to check on reported after-hours light use. The officer's handwritten report states flatly that they found the theater dark and no one present. The projectionist's log for that same night lists a run beginning at 11:58 p.m. and continuing to 12:38 a.m. The apprentice's transfer taken later that week contains a frame sequence that includes a brief cutaway to a custodian's ladder propped in the lobby, an interior image that neither officer nor projectionist mentions. The overlap of these records creates a negative space where testimony and physical trace diverge. At its slowest, the descent is a record of diminishing returns from standard conservation practice. Splices, once mended, apparently reappeared or migrated. Frame counts, once fixed, yielded different start points in subsequent scans. Marks made to stabilize history sometimes failed to remain. The apprentice's repeated work produced not clarity, but a proliferation of variants. The documentation stacks upon itself like strata of deposits that do not conform to a single chronological model. To give the descent a single concrete interruption, the apprentice's last substantial set of transfer logs includes a capture he labeled Transfer H. Transfer H shows a clear sequence, then a 3-frame cut to an overhead view of the auditorium as seen from near the screen, then a sharp return to the ongoing internal scene. The overhead view includes a detail the apprentice circled, a solitary chair in the back row with a tag on its armrest. He wrote in the margin, "Armrest tag reads RH. Hand lens confirms embossed letters." The file contains an attached photograph taken from the transfer at 100% magnification. The letters are legible. The tag corresponds to no entry in the theater seating inventory and to no known production prop. The presence of such a readable artifact in a two-frame insertion demonstrates the kind of concreteness the apprentice kept chasing. The selection of that tag is not an emotive flourish. It exemplifies the descent's core pattern. The more exacting the pursuit of evidence, the more the evidence yields specific, reproducible anomalies that nonetheless conflict with the structural presumption of a stable real. The apprentice attempted to force the real into a stable map by marking, transferring, and comparing, but his instruments produced an accumulation of distinct and incompatible maps instead. The lab's internal communications shifted in tone as a result. Early notes are neutral and technical. Later memoranda show a narrowing of options. A lab supervisor wrote, "We are encountering repeated, localized frame reordering and the sporadic inclusion of interior house frames in transfers. There is no evidence of post-collection tampering. The stock appears continuous. Recommend suspension of further photochemical duplication pending review of containment procedures." The recommendation frames the matter as one of containment rather than explanation. By this stage, institutional caution had begun to compete with professional curiosity. The apprentice did not heed every caution. His notes show that he conducted one final set of controlled runs, intended to test whether decreases in handling frequency would stabilize sequence. He reduced runs to 1 per week, increased the warm-up period, and implemented an isolated gate test in the booth, where no observation beyond the lab capture would be permitted. The immediate effect was contrary to his expectation. The next transfer recorded 2 new interior frames positioned near the reel's terminus. They show the auditorium's curtain edge and a close view of the booth plate with the projector's shutter visible in reflection. The apprentice appended a short description: new house frames at terminus after reduced runs. He rendered the observation with the precision of a technician and the unglossed language of someone who could no longer claim disbelief. By the time the apprentice's methodical mapping entered the preservation lab's workflow, the reel had already demonstrated a capacity to relocate its internal elements. The descent stage of this file is not a linear unmasking, but a progressive narrowing of available interpretations. Each new test removes some hypotheses and generates others. The documentation becomes thicker and, paradoxically, less reconcilable. Existent records multiply. Explanatory closure does not follow. Material constraints also begin to take effect. The film stock was fragile. Repeated projection produces heat and stress that risk further loss. The lab placed handling limits in its reports. The apprentice noted these limits in his own hand and continued to work within them until those constraints began to influence what could be known. When the lab finally marked sections "Do not run," the apprentice revised his methods toward non-invasive capture. He attempted macro photography of sprocket edges and contact sheets of individual frames. Even these less aggressive approaches did not yield conformity. They did, however, produce more of the same sort of specificity that had come to define the case. Readable seat tags, legible pencil marks that had not been present earlier, and small interior frames that show the booth from impossible perspectives. The descent closes with a tightened register of knowledge and a widened ledger of unresolvable detail. The apprentice's work converted anecdote into structured contradiction. The materials by then included calibrated transfers, spectrographic adhesive tests, high magnification perforation plates, and the set of loose interior frames that had first hinted at the reel's capacity to record parts of the theater itself. The more the apprentice pursued certainty, the more he documented the reel moving away from fixity. I do not record what those who handled the materials felt. The packet preserves procedure rather than emotion. What the material preserves is a pattern. Disciplined, repeatable methods produced reproducible inconsistencies, and those inconsistencies increasingly took the form of interior theater images embedded in the reel's end segments. Institutional caution rose, lab recommendations multiplied, limits on projection testing were proposed. The apprentice's notes end in a series of dated comparisons that illustrate the case's narrowing form. The files close for this stage with a catalog of specific anomalies and a clear procedural impasse. The reel no longer yielded a single stable ordering under careful scrutiny, and efforts to map it more precisely produced a proliferation of internally contradictory records. This section of the packet contains the clearest, most damaging cluster of materials I was able to assemble. The records converge on a single, unmistakable escalation. The reel ceased to be merely inconsistent and began to include images of the exhibition space that no camera in ordinary use could have recorded. Those interior frames is culminated in a sequence in which the deceased projectionist appears inside the booth while the film was being run years after his last documented screening. The final documented run terminated not in a definitive public show or in laboratory transfer, but in a physical failure of the projector gate, partial destruction of the reel, and the abrupt disappearance of the apprentice who had assumed custody. The evidence for that sequence is fragmentary, degraded, and internally contradictory in places. It is nevertheless concentrated, repeatedly cross-referenced, and supported by independent physical analysis. I will reconstruct it from the surviving materials and note where records diverge or were interrupted. The apprentice planned and annotated the final controlled run in a manner consistent with his earlier comparative practice. His preparation notes include a dated checklist, a schematic of the spool positions, and a single-line justification for running the reel under isolation. Controlled single run to capture terminus under booth mic, isolated gate, lab camera. The note is signed and time-stamped in his hand. He appended a short addendum the evening prior. Reduce heat ramp, monitor lamp current, mic feed to recorder B, no observers. That procedural economy is important because it establishes intent and method. The apprentice sought to reduce variables by limiting human presence, lowering lamp output, and relying on simultaneous audio capture to corroborate visual sequence. He expected that eliminating handling and observation would stabilize the real, or at least allow an unambiguous capture of whatever instability remained. Laboratory and booth instrumentation records confirm that setup. The lab supplied an external camera to record the projected image from a fixed position in the auditorium, and separately, a portable high-resolution scanner was arranged to intercept frames after projection as they exited the gate. A condenser microphone was mounted near the booth console to capture officer and operator speech and any ambient motion inside the booth. Power usage logs appended to the municipal transfer show a single lamp run recorded on the theater meter from 11:59 p.m. to midnight 21 a.m. on the date recorded as the last known screening. The appliance amperage traces indicate a steady lamp threshold until an abrupt peak immediately prior to circuit interruption. Those technical markers anchor the timing of subsequent entries and the arrival of police. The earliest material consequence of that isolated run appears in the lab's preliminary transfer. The lab engineer appended a short, stark observation to the transfer log. Frames near terminus include interior house view, camera positions inconsistent with known booth geometry. This sentence is terse but precise. The frames the engineer referred to are present among the loose scans and match the same sequence I encountered in the high-resolution contact sheets. The scans show an ordered succession, a tight view of the curtain hem, an aisle lamp reflected in the curtain fabric, a mid-range of the first 7 rows with the aisle marker visible, and then 2 frames that place the imaging device inside the projection booth, looking out toward the auditorium. The perspective shift is not a gradual zoom or a dissolving match cut. It is a sudden change in camera position that the lab found could not be accounted for by any standard in-house or external camera placement. One of those interior booth frames is a highly specific and reproducible detail that played a central role in subsequent authentication. It shows the projectionist seated at the console, his left hand on the shutter lever, his right hand resting on a ragged patch of adhesive tape on the cuff of his work shirt. The exact adhesive patch is the same square of cloth-backed tape that appears in the projectionist's repair notes, where he had sketched his hand and annotated a list of repeated cuffs and repairs. The apprentice highlighted that correspondence and appended it to the transfer as corroboration. Cuff patch matches sketch P03. See Projectionist Notebook 1212. The notebook sketch predates the audio and video material in the transfer by months. That cross-reference is not conclusive on its own, but it increased the weight of the interior frames by linking them to a physical detail present in an independent, handwritten document. Authenticating the frames was a technical priority for the lab. The laboratory preservation report contains a dense series of tests and conclusions. Among them, a spectrographic analysis of the emulsion and an optical density survey are relevant here. The report notes in a passage later excerpted in an internal memo that frames identified as interior house and booth exposures are contiguous with the surrounding negative. No evidence of optical compositing or photographic replacement within the sequence. Grain structure and emulsion chemistry consistent throughout sample area. That language is technical and deliberately conservative. The lab did not assert provenance beyond the film stock itself, but it disqualified the simplest contrary hypothesis, namely that the interior frames had been spliced in from an external source. The lab also recorded anomalies. A micrographic inspection of sprocket perforations adjacent to the interior frames showed localized deformation inconsistent with a single continuous projection pressure pattern. The deformation indicates the reel had experienced varying gate tension when those frames were recorded, or when they later reshuffled inside the stock. The report documented this as a mechanical irregularity without assigning causality. Alongside the visual material, the booth microphone recorded a fragmented audio track. The recording survived in a partially damaged file and in a degraded cassette copy recovered from the booth console after entry. The waveform shows a period of steady projector hum, a low mechanical thrum, several human utterances, and a final peak of distortion. The lab produced a short transcript fragment in a study note, which I will quote only in the briefest form because the materials are themselves the evidence and because the voice is a corroborating element for other records. The transcript includes 2 short lines separated by nonverbal noise. The first is the apprentice's voice saying, "running at 1:05," followed by an indistinct cough. The second is a lower voice that matches the spectral profile of the projectionist's earlier recorded speech. The lab transcript rendered that line as, "It is wrong at the end." A later forensic annotation added that the lower voice's spectral match to the projectionist's reference file was 96%. Those are lab statements. They are not an interpretation. They are a measurement. The interior frames continue in the transferred sequence, and then a small set of images follows that drove the escalation to its most consequential moment. The next frames present a close-up of the booth interior from an oblique position that would have required the lens to be between the 2 projector heads and slightly below eye level. The frame shows the projectionist's profile turned toward the projector, and behind him the small plate of the booth door with its municipal inventory sticker. The sticker bears a number that matches the police property inventory entered after the theater was finally secured. That sticker was later listed in the municipal inventory as Item 7. The coincidence of the sticker in the frame and in the inventory is, again, a material tie between photographic evidence and bureaucratic record. It cannot, on its own, establish when the image was created. It does, however, anchor the images to the physicality of the booth as it existed at the time the inventory was taken. Even as the visual and spectral analyses accumulated, discrepancies mounted. The apprentice's own side-by-side frame counts in his running logs do not match the transferred sequence. He had recorded a splice at frame 1276, a tabbed cement repair at 1353, and an insertion of a leader at 1371. The lab transfer shows none of those features at the indicated counts. Instead, the transfer contains the interior frames beginning in the mid-1300s and continuing to near 1400. The apprentice recorded the positions in his last annotated map and labeled them as verified by booth counter. His final annotation near the margins reads, "Counter reset. See mic time." The counters, the mic, and the transfer disagree in ways that, taken together, reduce the usefulness of any single timeline. They also increase the sense that the material itself redistributed its own internals under observation. The most damaging evidence arrives with the sequence that follows those internal booth views. The transfer contains a contiguous set of frames that show the projectionist as an active, present operator. He is seated, hands engaged with controls, head inclined slightly, and in at least one frame he looks directly toward the imaging device. The lab compared the facial features of the person in those frames to police files and to the projectionist's earlier documented images. The facial match was established by a municipal forensic analyst at a level described in their note as sufficient for positive identification in the absence of alternative subjects. The municipal analyst appended a brief observation. Physical features, habitual posture, and clothing match subject John H., projectionist file P001. The subject John H. had been documented in earlier municipal records as having ceased regular screenings by the date given in his notebook, and was later found deceased in his apartment by a neighbor months prior to the apprentice's final run. The death date, the coroner's preliminary report, and the municipal case file are present in the packet as independent documents. There is one further detail in the images that the technicians emphasized to me when I examined their notes. In the frame where the projectionist appears looking toward the imaging device, the lamp glare is visible reflected in the glass of his spectacles. The reflection shows a partial filament shape, inconsistent with the lamp head in use at the time of transfer. The lab reserved the phrase optical anomaly in its internal commentary and hesitated to render a conclusive judgment. Its forensic summary continued to exclude post-processing, but accepted that the capture contained elements that could not be reconstructed using standard techniques available to their facility. The projector failed within seconds of those frames in the transfer. According to the lab log and to the municipal power traces, the projector gate experienced a rapid thermal event. The lab's fire and heat analysis documents the aftermath. Localized melting of emulsion and base film near the terminus, irregular charring on the leader, and charred fragments fused to the gate assembly consistent with immediate high-temperature exposure. The gate assembly itself suffered heat transfer marks aligned with the frame set that contained the booth images. A preservation note reads, "Partial film fusion to gate causing stuck roll. Removal required destructive cutting for extraction." The technician who performed that extraction annotated the note with a simple addendum. Burn-in gate observed extreme localized damage. The physical cost was significant. The reel was no longer runnable in its original form. The physical damage introduced an evidentiary closure of sorts. It destroyed the material conditions necessary for repeated observation and simultaneously produced a record of the eruption. The fused film fragments, the charred sprocket segments, and the microscopic emulsion bubbles that only heat can produce. Those artifacts were retained and later photographed for the transfer, then catalogued as evidence. They remain in the file in the form of microphotographs and a partial spool marked Evidence Hold. The archive retains these items in restricted custody. The aftermath outside the technical record is also documented. Municipal records show that police were summoned to the theater at 12:29 a.m. by a neighbor reporting an active lamp through the blinds. The police log includes a short field report from the responding officer. The officer's entry is procedural and sparse. Arrived at premises, booth door locked from inside, lamp heat present, spool warm to touch, no subject located on premises, personal effects observed on console, ran inventory, no sign of forced entry. The officer turned the building over to municipal preservation agents and filed a missing person report for the apprentice the next morning at 10:10 a.m. The missing persons report references the last confirmed time, seen as 11:54 p.m. on the date of the run. The apprentice's personal notebook and the annotated reel map were recovered from the console and included in the property inventory. One of the most disturbing subsequent fragments is a short municipal memo that attempts to reconcile the physical evidence with human occupancy. The memo is unsigned and fragmentary. It reads in part, "Console items indicate single operator presence. Lamp warm. No body. Immediate search negative. Isolated access. Exterior doors intact. Recommend, hold, and no rerun." The memo marks the beginning of an institutional decision to stop further projection testing until a more comprehensive protocol could be defined. It also signals a turning away from direct engagement with the material in an operational environment. The apprentice's absence was never explained in the municipal or police files that were transferred to my custody. His last annotated entry in his own log, dated 12:01 a.m., reads only, "Terminus captured, transfer B." That is the last substantive note in his hand. The municipal files contain no later recorded communication from him. No body was found, and there were no signs of struggle that the police recorded. The municipal missing person case file remains open in local records, but was placed under administrative hold when the Preservation Office decided to restrict access to the reel and its supporting items. The decision was driven as much by liability and safety as by evidentiary concern. There is one final subset of materials that ties several threads together, and that I must note for its specific, destabilizing detail. After the initial locking of the booth and prior to the lab extraction, a municipal preservation technician made a set of emergency contact prints of the fragments fused to the gate. Those prints were taken at 150 times magnification and reveal an unusual micro-pattern embedded in the softened emulsion at the point of fusion. The technician annotated the pattern as resembling a short sequence of indentations, like a regular abrasion pattern in 3 bands. The pattern corresponds exactly to the spine of the projectionist's notebook when pressed into the console as a makeshift patch in a repair, he described in a separate page. The technician's note is hesitant. It reads, "Microabrasion corresponds to pattern PNB spine. Correlation noted but unexplained." The effect of that correlation is procedural rather than interpretive. It is, however, another physical tie that links the projectionist's personal hand, the booth's hardware, and the damaged frames in the gate. At this stage, the file contains several mutually corroborating elements and several unavoidable fails. The corroborations are the lab's finding that the interior images were not composited, the audio spectral match tying the lower voice on the last recording to the projectionist's earlier voice file, the presence of municipal inventory sticker visible in an interior frame, and the matching adhesive cuff detail. The failures are the absence of the apprentice, the destruction of the reel's terminus, the disagreement between counter-based splice notes and transferred frame positions, and the impossibility of the camera positions represented in the interior frames given the theater's geometry. Those oppositions are documented and specific. They produce a narrowing of interpretation rather than a closure. I include one brief and direct excerpt from the final damaged booth recording because it is both concise and evidentiary. It appears on the transcript as a single line, barely legible through distortion and the projector hum. The line reads, "Red light on the curtain." It is attributed in the lab transcript to the lower voice that matched the projectionist. The line is notable because it echoes an earlier phrase in the projectionist's notebooks, where he repeatedly noted a wrong light in the terminus and circled the curtain hem as an anchor point for repairs. The correspondence of phraseology is not, by itself, a proof of temporal causation. It does, however, produce a pattern of repeated fixation between the projectionist's recorded texts and the material audio record captured during the final run. The final escalation closes with both physical and procedural consequence. The reel was damaged beyond routine recovery in the gate and required destructive removal. The apprentice disappeared between the time his single isolated run was completed and the time municipal personnel arrived. The lab and police logs contain no indication that further projection trials were authorized. Access to the remaining loose frames, the fused gate fragments, the cassette audio, and the notebook pages was restricted and later transferred to my custody under municipal evidence transfer rules. The materials are now housed in the restricted archives as part of the consolidated file. I note the limits of the present reconstruction. The reel no longer exists in a runnable form. The precise moment those interior frames entered the stock cannot be stated with certainty because the counter records, while present, contradict the transfer sequence. The apprentice's disappearance prevents us from interviewing the single technician who was attempting a systematic resolution, and the projectionist whose visage appears in the later frames is deceased and unable to be queried. Those absences are material and not merely administrative. They reduce our ability to triangulate a temporal order beyond the clustered indications I have described. What remains is a concentrated evidentiary knot, a damaged reel that incorporated imagery of its own exhibition space, laboratory analysis that ruled out simple compositing, an audio record linking the projectionist's phrasing across notebooks and the last run, charred and fused physical artifacts attesting to an extreme thermal event in the gate, and a missing technician who had been attempting to generate a stable mapping of the material. The final material impression left by the last documented screening is one of narrowing access. The evidence is both more specific in certain respects and more irretrievably partial in others. The file ends not with explanation, but with a physical restriction and a set of corroborating object-level anomalies that cannot be resolved by further routine lab work, because the single reel that produced them was mechanically altered during the event in question. I close this file with the statement of what survives, what does not, and what cannot be recovered without new access that has been denied. The reel that initiated the packet no longer exists in runnable form. Its terminus was thermally altered in the booth gate during the final documented run and had to be removed by destructive means. The projectionist is deceased. The apprentice who executed the comparative program is missing and has not been located. Those three absences are the primary, irretrievable limitations on temporal reconstruction. No runnable object, no living projectionist, no accountable technician to question about method or motive. What remains in custody is specific and materially varied. The packet I catalogued contains the projectionist's soft-bound notebooks with correction marks and circled phrases, the apprentice's comparative sheets and annotated contact prints, the lab's calibrated transfers and spectrographic adhesive tests, a small set of loose frames showing interior house perspectives, the fused fragments recovered from the gate, the emergency high magnification prints taken at 150 times enlargement, and the cassette recording made in the booth during the last run. Municipal inventory stickers, repair tags, and a short set of police and municipal access logs accompany these artifacts. Each item is described in the inventory notes I appended when the transfer completed. The evidentiary picture is simultaneously constrained and concrete. Laboratory analyses established that the interior house frames were not composite insertions in a post-collection digital sense. The adhesive consistency across the fused fragments matched the stock in the transfers. Voice spectral comparison tied the lower voice on the damaged cassette to the projectionist's earlier recorded voice sample. A technician's microphotograph showed an abrasion pattern in the fused emulsion that matched the spine of the projectionist's notebook pressed into the console in an improvised repair, a correlation the technician recorded as correlation noted but unexplained. These are specific, repeatable points of material correspondence that connect human action, booth hardware, and the altered film stock. Contradictions remain equally specific. The counter-based splice notes written in the booth disagree with the transferred frame positions reported by the preservation lab. The apprentice's mapping sheets, produced under controlled duplication conditions, produced multiple incompatible orderings for the reel's terminus. The loose interior frames depict camera positions that are impossible given the theater's documented geometry and the physical constraints of the booth and auditorium. The fused fragments reveal charred emulsion absent from earlier transfers. Collectively, these oppositions are not metaphorical. They are itemized entries in the lab reports and municipal logs. Administrative action narrowed future inquiry. A preservation supervisor recommended suspension of photochemical duplication. Municipal records contain a short directive. I quote exactly because it governs subsequent access. No further projection authorized. That order was followed. Access to the loose frames, the fused fragments, the cassette and the notebooks was restricted and transferred to my custody under municipal evidence transfer protocols. Requests for additional projection trials were denied on technical and safety grounds and were refused when framed as research proposals. Laboratory personnel noted handling limits in internal memoranda and coded several sections of the packet. Do not run. Those labels are now affixed in the restricted holdings. Two brief fragments from the materials encapsulate the file's locked quality. The first is a lone line from the final damaged recording, transcribed in the lab log with difficulty through hiss and hum. Red light on the curtain. The second is the technician's handwritten annotation on the fused fragment print. Microabrasion corresponds to pattern P NB spine. Each fragment connects to the larger material record, but neither resolves how interior house imagery came to be incorporated into the reel, or when exactly those frames first appeared. I have catalogued cross-references in the vault's holdings that may bear tangentially on this packet. Those references are procedural and not interpretive. They do not change what is materially unavailable: the original runnable reel, an accountable living witness who oversaw the last systematic runs, and a continuous non-contradictory set of counter-records linking every projection to a single verifiable frame order. The missing technician and the destroyed terminus reduce our ability to triangulate sequence more than any lab uncertainty does. What is left as evidence is therefore a cluster of constrained facts and a locus of prohibition. The artifacts in this file are precise in their physical detail and partial in their temporal claims. They allow the lab to assert that the interior frames are not later compositing and to link recorded voice fragments to an identified individual. They do not allow us to state when, by what means, or under what conditions the material rearranged itself. They do not permit a reconstruction of the reel as a single, stable object that could be projected to verify competing mappings. I note, finally, the file's administrative disposition. The packet remains sealed in restricted archive custody. Access is limited to authorized preservation specialists working under municipal authorization and to my review in the exercise of vault record consolidation. Further projection testing will not be authorized without formal municipal consent and a risk assessment that has not been requested. The file is therefore closed to routine examination and is retained under the evidentiary controls established at transfer. The evidence thus terminates in two complementary certainties and a set of absences. It is certain that a damaged reel produced interior house imagery and that the material record documents that output with corroborating laboratory measures. It is equally certain that the single reel that made those documents cannot currently be run, and the primary technician who sought to resolve the contradictions is missing. The record ends in restriction rather than explanation. The packet remains intact as items and notes. The anomaly remains unresolved. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.